Okay, I'm going to go through some very practical steps of using Freedom of Information requests now. So step one is kind of obvious, and I'm not going to spend any time on this. You need to know your subject, you need to do a bit of background research, you need to put some time in before you put your request in, and that might be the time you've already put in a research project, or you might have to do a bit of extra research. And you have to have some kind of context knowledge about the subject. Step two, you need to know what's out there in terms of previous Freedom of Information requests. So the issue that's very current as I speak, but I know this might make this presentation very dated very quickly, is the issue of the Prime Minister's refurbishment of the Downing Street flat. It may become a big political issue, it may be a contributory factor to his downfall, and it may not, it might just be consigned to the dustbin of history. But I'll repeat the point I made earlier. This didn't come from a Freedom of Information request. Of course, it came from a series of carefully placed statements by his former aide, Dominic Cummings. But if you were looking, and one of the interesting things is that there have been a flurry of Freedom of Information requests about that refurbishment. Check out the website, which is really the go-to place for previous Freedom of Information requests. It's a centralised site that gathers Freedom of Information requests, whatdotheyknow.com. If you check that out for around this period, late April 2021, there's been a flurry of Freedom of Information requests about that issue. But if you check a bit further back, you'll find that there were really interesting Freedom of Information requests about exactly the same topic, which give you really interesting context. I've got one here that was sent in on the 3rd of April 2021, and it gives some kind of details about particularly taxation, what the tax liabilities are, which of course is a big issue right now that's being reported on, because HMRC are investigating the tax liabilities. So it's worth going back in history to look at the Freedom of Information requests that have been issued before on the subject that you're looking at. Think about the scale of your request. Step three. This is crucial. This is where we get down to the more kind of the real practicalities, because one of the most common refusals for those requests is that it costs too much. And the kind of rule of thumb for central government is the cost limit, and it's always an estimate, and it's very difficult for us to know because we don't know how long it takes to retrieve particular types of information. We're always kind of guessing. But the rule of thumb is 3 days, both for central government and for other public authorities. So regardless of whether it's the £600 or £450 limit, the rule of thumb is 3 days. So if you're asking for something that is going to take more than 3 days, then it can be refused. And there are different ways of thinking about that. I mean, and very practical ways of thinking about that. First of all, you might not want to go in for all the information in one go, because that might be prohibitively expensive. It might take too much time. You may also want to ask much more kind of subtle questions first as a kind of preemptive line of inquiry. So it's perfectly legitimate for you to ask a question about what is there before you ask for the information itself. And I'll say something more about that in a moment. So you need to think about step 4, the limits of how open and how much disclosure about yourself you want to give. And look, I think it's always useful just to be as open as possible, because it's always likely that those you're asking questions of will want to know about you and why you're asking it, right? So you don't have to disclose your identity, and you don't have to disclose the purpose of your inquiry, but you need to be aware that there might also be checks on you. If I'm asking questions again about the prosecutions of employers for breaching safety regulations, then they're going to do a Google search on me and find out that's one of my research interests, and so there's no point really in me trying to hide that or not be open about that. I think that's often overlooked. But you don't have to say why you're looking for information, and that's a very common mistake. People go into length about why they want to obtain the information. That's not necessary at all, and it's not really relevant in terms of the way the legislation is framed. Step 5, it's always useful to try and make contact, if you can, with the person that might be dealing with your request before or as you are submitting your request. And I think that you can do that almost informally. If you do have, sometimes it's an automated form online, and the process that you go through, the authority that you want to ask information from, you should always check their website and see how they prefer that information to be requested. Sometimes it's an online form, sometimes there's an email address, and sometimes there's even a phone number. And I would always encourage people to make direct contact. And even to go back to step 3, think about asking for a schedule of information that exists on your subject. So maybe ask for a list of the types of information that is held. The other reason for making contact is that public authorities are legally obliged. They have an obligation to assist you in your inquiry. So they may give you assistance in understanding what might be possible and what might not be possible, what's there, and what you might have access to. Obviously, we're always suspicious, and obviously we're not going to necessarily take that information on face value, but it's useful to have that kind of dialogue. So I've already mentioned the schedule of information, step 6. That helps you be as specific as possible. The other thing about being specific, and this arose, I think there was a key decision in 2010 relating to emails that were sent from Michael Gove's personal email account. The Information Commissioner ruled that was perfectly applicable. Of course, some of the issues around Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and his texts to various business leaders have also been the subject of freedom of information requests. So that tells us something, that we should think about the full range of formats that the information might come in. It's perfectly legitimate to ask for private emails, for texts, if those texts were made in relation to a function of public office. I will always say, please furnish or please supply me with all written paper records and records held in electronic formats, and sometimes we'll say including text messages and so on. And that just gives you that just covers all bases, if you like. So keep in contact. As I said before, the public authorities has an obligation to help you. Try and keep in contact with the person that you've asked the information for. I think it's always useful to never think that it's a kind of closed or a kind of a kind of one-off exercise. You're always going to be going back for information, because you're never going to get the information in a complete form, and very rarely in the first instance. So think about, when you go into freedom of information requests, think about it as an ongoing process, as something you might have to go back again for and ask supplementary requests. And of course that means that it's going to be very advantageous to keep a good relationship with the person who's dealing with your request. Remember that we sometimes over suspicious about this. Remember, the person that you're asking the information from is not necessarily formally representing the organisation, but doesn't necessarily have a kind of political or emotional kind of connection to the organisation. That means that they want to prevent you finding out about it. Very often, employees in public organisations want that information to be made available and want to help people to request that. So I think to approach this with a healthy cynicism, but also with an openness that you may well be assisted more than you expect, is going to be useful in this. Step 8, I've already said quite a bit about that in terms of the methodological limits, but there's always going to be limits of your data, limits to your data, and remember that you can ask for it in the format that you require. So if you're asking for statistical numerical data, you might want to ask for it in an Excel spreadsheet, or other forms of software are available, of course. Or you might want to ask for it in a Word document if it's textual material, so you can edit it more easily, and so on. That's again part of your entitlement to request the format in which the information comes in. Remember that you're playing a long game, not just in terms of going back again and repeating different aspects or asking for new information. But step 9, you're playing a long game very often, that you will not necessarily get the response you want in the first response. And that means that very often the 28-day statutory period, the period that they should be supplying the information, is extended, and very often that's extended. They have to notify you of a reason for that extension and a kind of estimated revised time period that you'll get the information back. But playing the long game as well, I think, is important in the sense that you should always be prepared to appeal. And the mechanism for appealing it's very simple. You go to the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, and there's very clear instructions about how you appeal on the ICO's website. And you should always kind of healthy skepticism, positive attitude, but be prepared for the worst, and be prepared that you'll have to go through an appeal for the information. And I think that's really, the kind of key steps, and a very brief introduction to how you approach your requests, and how you think about how that data might be used subsequently in your research project. So I'll leave it there, and I hope to see, if you're interested in this, I hope to see you at some point on one of my courses. But most of all, I hope that this encourages people to request information using this process to support their research, because it's something that we should make more of. It's something researchers don't make enough of, in my opinion, and it's something that does contribute to a healthier democracy if we are able to get information out. And I don't actually mean information about Boris Johnston's interior decoration. In a way, that's a side issue to the big issues about power that we can be asking, and the big issues about power that we can answer. Sometimes it can help us to answer those questions if we get access to the information that we're entitled to.